Good morning, people of the internet. You're listening to the last episode of Debi Radio 79.5 FM, a podcast where we have been discussing the movie Grosse Pointe Blank 1 minute at a time. I am Dev.
And I'm Hugh, your other co-host, and we finally here are moving into minute 107 and the end of the credits as they roll.
And joining us once again, we have two guests. We have Richard Cottrell and Graham Smith, who've come back to join us, having now seen the whole movie. You may remember them from a few weeks ago when we threw them in halfway through the film with no context whatsoever. They've got that context now, and they are back to join us for our last ever episode. Welcome back, guys.
Hello again.
Thanks for having us back.
So these credits are largely music for this. It's the soundtrack has been a recurring theme throughout our recordings. It is I think it's been talked about in almost every minute, if not every minute. It's a huge part of what makes this film a success in my mind. It's one of the things that people will generally speak about when they talk about remembering this film is the scoring and how great the soundtrack is. And of course, it kind of sets that precedent for, maybe what most people consider as John Cusack's greatest film, High Fidelity, which is all about the music. So we have a slightly longer than a minute here as well. I should call that out. There was technically 23 seconds in what would be episode 108, going from 107 minutes to 107 minutes, 23 seconds. I did cheat a little bit and just folded it all into one, because of that 23 seconds, the majority of it is just the Hollywood Pictures logo. And whilst we could spend more time talking about Buena Vista Pictures and the Hollywood Pictures business model and what they were doing, we have talked about that quite a bit in the opening credits. So
yeah, we did.
A little bit of cheating there, but hopefully the audience will forgive us.
That and you can secure Richard and myself for a third episode this week.
He didn't want to push his luck.
No.
Yeah, it's bad enough he forced you to watch the film, right?
No comment.
You thought you'd be the one set of friends who got away with it.
Well, I'm just looking forward to a year's time where Dev's like, oh yeah, what about, and then names another film. I'm like, nah, never seen that. And it'll all start again.
No, I now know if Dev asks, have you seen this film? The answer is yes. Doesn't matter whether I have or not.
And if he asks for details, you're like, it was a long time ago, my memory's kind of fuzzy about it, and just, blag it from there.
I feel like you guys have been taking lessons from my wife on this front. The instant reaction to any film is, oh yeah, no, I've seen that, because she knows otherwise she's going to be made to see it.
Yeah. To be fair, Kim has a similar reaction as well. Yeah. So shall we talk about songs? Because this is arguably the biggest. I think for people who saw this film at the time, I think the music was important. But I think for people who came to this film later, after High Fidelity was a big success, I feel like that's the thing that helps connect the two and cement them as the kind of 1-2 opening punch of Cusack's production career, but also the two films that very much define his public image in the 90s into the noughties, as opposed to those 80s films that he'd been in.
Yeah.
Well, it was something we commented on in our minute, because 99 Love Balloons turns up pretty early on in our first minute, and I remember making a big deal about that, and also how they were doing it as a show of distance in the school as the body got moved further away into the depths to be disposed of. But yeah, it's one of those things where you keep, as you go through the credits and you see all the films, you're like, oh yeah, that's a great song. That's a great song. They've got Live and Let Die, 2 versions of it in there.
Yeah.
You've got Take on Me by a-ha. You've got Ace of Spades, which will always get me head banging when that starts. It's a really good soundtrack.
Yeah.
And this is 1997. So at this point we've had Mortal Kombat, we've had The Crow, we've had, do you know what I mean? There's a list of iconic soundtracks at this time, often quite heavily dependent on British artists as well. You know, I mean, I think this, this is the point where Britpop and and Cool Britannia are starting to really get into full swing, right?
I mean, yes. Although I feel like one of the interesting things there is that the films generally use older British music. They're
Oh
not
yeah,
using
absolutely.
Oasis and Blur and
No,
Spice Girls,
absolutely.
which are the hotness at this point in time, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it does that. Yeah, I'm just
But
saying it just
yeah,
happens to be an interesting thing that all of these soundtracks that people look back on and go, "Oh, that was such a great soundtrack." You realize how many British artists of the past and present,
yeah.
were part of
But
it.
I think ever since kind of from the 60s all the way through to the 80s and to an extent the 90s, there is a very, very prominent British presence on the global music stage, right? And
Yeah.
and that is it's kind of interesting to see that reflected in this. You very easily could have done this film with Bruce Springsteen or Billy Idol or like
Mm-hmm.
much more American tunes, the Ramones even, right? Like you
Mm-hmm.
could have had those in here and it would have worked. It would have worked really well.
Absolutely.
And yet it's you get Joe Strummer on board and you go with the Clash and you go with the Specials and English Pete and Echo and the Bunnymen, and it's a very different, well, it's a slightly different vibe. It's maybe a less insular vibe. I think if you'd gone with those kind of Midwestern American musicians that have kind of bridging that rock country kind of divide, it would have given a much less appealing film for foreign markets. Certainly for us in the UK, I don't think I'd have found this film nearly as engaging if it had been a load of Bruce Springsteen kind of very championing American people and American workers kind of vibe, especially disconcerting considering it's all set in a fairly wealthy suburb of Detroit.
I was going to say that would change the sort of feel of it quite a lot, going from not generic with the non-American things, but suddenly going to, again, not patriotic. Obviously, I mean, Bruce Springsteen, I think, not the word to use there, but very
No, but
American
championing
still.
American people, right? And maybe not
Yeah,
the nation, but certainly the people of it, right? Yeah.
yeah, the things that are perhaps have been pushed aside in the setting, the things that might have been there the 10 years earlier, but have, I mean, yeah, having
Yeah.
now watched it all, there were the numerous comments about the cars.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's kind of an undergoing theme of like it not being so insular and so self-reliant in the globalization and how it coming in, nobody buys American anymore for the cars comment, and there's other things like that about kind of those who have stayed not really succeeding, whereas those who left have grown to a degree, not necessarily in a good way, I would say, for Martin, our main character here. He's kind of grown in a very interesting manner. And if you kept the music American, that wouldn't have worked as well as having, like we mentioned a lot of UK music, but 99 Luftballon obviously is not. Like it brings that international feel to it, and that it isn't all blue America is all red, white, and blue America is the best. It is, a global stage.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, absolutely. And also we have in here a couple little bits of unique scoring for the film. It looks like one of the Live and Let Die recordings may have actually been done specifically for the film by Adam Fields.
That's the music. That's the music version.
Yeah,
You get that when he walks over the threshold, you go from Guns N' Roses to music.
Yeah. And also cheating a little bit here. There is it was technically in the previous minute, but I didn't mention it on yesterday's episode. There is a track titled War Cry by Joe Strummer, which is the instrumental piece that's kind of quite electronic that plays whilst Martin is getting ready to go to the reunion, which is a piece I'd always wondered about and hadn't been able to place previously, which leaves only one bit of musical scoring that really bugs me that I don't know much more about it, which we discussed at the time, but is the kind of Irish funerary dirge that plays out whilst Martin is dumping whiskey over his dad's grave, with some lyrics there as well, which as far as I can tell, is not referenced in these music credits at all.
I would not be surprised, given his interest in music. By this point, his interest in global folk music. Well, would not be surprised if that's just something Strummer bashed out for them.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Warcry may have had a little bit more consideration to it. You can actually find it as a standalone track on YouTube, but then again, you can find everything on YouTube these days, except apparently that funerary dirge. But yeah.
So we've got Strummer, we've got world music, we've got a nod to the roots of America, but then we have, as we said, this wide range of 70s and 80s pieces that define an earlier generation, that are meant to define the characters here from 10 years earlier. But at the same time, it is also interesting how much of this stuff. I wonder how much. I'm trying to remember in '97 how many of these. Not the British ones. I'm thinking about the American artists here. I'm intrigued as to how many people in Britain did know Violent Femmes. You know what I mean? Like, and certainly the Pixies were big in England first. Monkey Gone to Heaven was a hit in '88. So, there's not that many things on here that wouldn't be known to a British audience. But then again, I do wonder, because I knew the Violent Femmes, but only because I was into American college rock in the '80s and worked on university radio here in England. So, that was the sort of thing we played.
I think there's a few things that may have been a little less known. English Beat, I don't think had really remained in prominence. And I know my introduction to them was definitely through this film. Fantastic as they are, I think they got overshadowed in the UK by Madness and Madness's
very much
success.
so.
That was an oddity. Strange coincidence, because that was in the minute that one of the minutes we watched.
Oh, good point.
And I'd first come across that Mirror in the Bathroom track about a week before when it came on the radio.
Oh, interesting.
I picked it up on the radio, and then in the minute I was going, I've heard that very recently. Oh, yeah, there we go.
I must say, I've done some of these, I don't recognize the song initially, and kind of having to look them up again. And sometimes it's the title that jumps out at me, such as The Dominatrix Sleeps Tonight, which just as a song title, I'm like, what on earth is that? But it's one of them, the Pogues one, which is right at the end of the musical credits.
Yeah.
Which I spotted that, and I stuck it up on YouTube. And if you have a look on YouTube, the second comment I see is either he's in love with that guy's daughter, or he's found a newfound respect for life. And then they just keep going and going and going, and then someone halfway down is like, the amount of Grosse Pointe Blank quotes on this comment section, makes me happy, because I came by it the same route.
Yeah.
Is one of those comments is me, right? Just
Probably.
checking.
I don't see you, but I'm using my non-logged in account, so doing an incognito for that. So,
it is this. Lorca's Novena is one of the last Pogues tracks before they basically gave up the ghost. It's that point in their career, his fifth album. It's the point where Shane is down to doing barely 2 or 3 songs an album, and he's also stopping gigging. I think I saw them on the tour where he literally sat down for most of the gig in Brighton and just let them, the others, Terry Dodds and the others, just picked up the music. But it is a really unusual piece as well. It's one of his odder songs.
Yeah.
And of course, him and Joe Strummer, the band, they were mates. They were in Alex Cox's disastrous spaghetti western together. They have a long history, so it's kind of fun to see not just that track, but just to see the Pogues there at all. They were never the kind of band who you would hear in an American film unless you were doing like an Irish gangster film,
Right. In which case, it's always the one song.
Well, I think I think they might be in the soundtrack of State of Grace, which is the one Boston set Irish gangster film I can think of from the 90s, because all the others are 2000s. But then, of course, the thing that always surprised me was The Wire. I never expected that in Baltimore it would be a thing with the police, and then of course it makes sense once you think about it. It makes complete sense that it is a natural thing for for American East Coast police forces to sing the Pogues at people's funerals.
And honestly, Lorca's Novena is very different to most of the Pogue stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
But it feels like a very, very much a Shane MacGowan passion project when you hear it. Like there is, and I think that's why it works so well. It is a fantastic piece.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of interesting stuff towards the end there. They really did keep surprising us. Miss them, and of course, poor Shane went recently.
Yeah.
Oh, and suddenly all the Irish media are like, "Yes, he was one of us." It was like, you didn't say that the first time around. You buggers.
I mean, similar things could be said about Thin Lizzy at the time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Phil Lynott was, found his fame abroad first. These people, London loved all of these guys first before Dublin finally went, yeah, all right then. But yeah,
all right.
It's such a great...
After that, we get kind of the standard role of Technicolor, Dolby Surround,
usual credits,
and then final credits for Buena Vista Pictures and Hollywood Pictures.
Yeah,
and that is the movie.
I mean, London Records again. For the time, big name for to have an indie film like this get its soundtrack on there, but also not a label given to indie soundtracks. Very much one of the stalwarts of the British music scene.
Yeah. And presumably a connection with Joe Strummer to kind of put that together, I guess.
Absolutely, because the rights must have been quite a mess to sort out, and that would have been easier. And in fact, I'm wondering if that's why there is... Actually, no, I don't know the answer to this. Why did films back then have to include a credit saying that they were a motion picture created for purposes of copyright law in the UK? Underneath the American copyright, there's a separate credit, and I know I've seen that on other American films, and I've just realised I have no idea why.
I'd assumed because work for the film was done in the UK. In this case, the scoring.
Which would then made the whole licensing of the music a lot easier.
Correct. Well, it's not just that, right? Because I mean, they're going to have sessions with Joe Strummer to record the compositional pieces. So you've got a business entity in the UK that is paying Joe Strummer for the work that's being done, right? I think that's what it comes down to, is effectively there is business being done in the UK for some element of this film, right? And in more modern films, that may be music, but it could equally likely be visual effects or whatever.
Oh yeah, these days it's you see credits for Canada, Australia, all that stuff, don't you? Yeah. I'm pretty sure I've seen films where there is literally nothing to do with the country that is listed as filmed in, except for the fact that there's an FX house based there.
Yeah.
So I've just done a quick Google on that, and the suggestion is that any work done in the UK is automatically copyrighted, but it's not clear who owns the copyright. So they declare it as part of the picture, which is why, like in this case, it's Grosse Pointe Productions Inc., which I can't imagine existed for the purposes of anything apart from this film.
Makes sense.
Whereas in Pixar films, you get it as part of Pixar. It's like Pixar Talking Pictures, I think.
Yes. Okay.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's like, bigger studios will have their house that deals with that, whereas indie pictures like this will do, its own shell company effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hollywood generally, a lot of stuff is done in shell companies because any litigation then is not going to jeopardize other productions. So it's a kind of safeguard against other work. So I'm kind of surprised that Pixar doesn't do that. But I guess for protecting IP, it's not nearly as big of a concern.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
it's fascinating.
Shall we wrap it?
Yeah. No. Let's. I can't believe it. I'm genuinely feeling quite emotional now that we have reached the end. It's a strange moment. So let's wrap this.
I think a little bit of time to break the fourth wall and thank folks who've actually stuck it out for 107 episodes of a podcast about a movie that I am passionate about, clearly, but may not be the biggest hit of all time. Thank you all for listening, and hopefully you found it interesting. And for the very last time. Hugh, would you like to take out the outro?
I will happily. So this was minute 107 plus of the Grosse Pointe Blank podcast, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, featuring your co-host, co-writers, and co-producers, myself, Hugh David, and the man who loves this film more than anyone else we know, Dev Soligar.
And joining us for this week, these last two episodes, we have had my friends Richard Cottrell and Graham Smith. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you for having us on.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find us still at all good podcast players, as well as on YouTube, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Spotify, at Debi Radio, and on our website, debiradio.com. And for all of those, it is DEBI Radio, and I'll be keeping those active for as long as I can.
And if you do want to still talk to us, we will also be keeping up running the Facebook listeners group, Debi Radio 79.5 FM, fan club, one last time, DEBI Radio. And can I just say one last thing, Dev, other than congratulations on your perseverance and your the drive with which you have put together your first and what I suspect is going to turn out to be your last podcast.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, you've put in so much hard work. And as somebody who used to run 3 podcasts at a time, I respect everything you've done. And I'm grateful to have been part of it. I also want to say to people, because this nearly came up with one of our recordings last night, and it was worth mentioning. For a startup podcast, we did actually try and reach out to some people on the film, and you managed to at least get a reply, presumably from her assistant, from Minnie Driver.
I did, yes. And it was a very kind reply, and
absolutely,
I appreciated that they took the time to do that.
Yeah. So Debi herself
absolutely
acknowledged the existence of the podcast and said, "Sorry, I would love to, but." And we thank her for that, and we thank her for at least taking the time to reply to us and to recognize the effort that you put in. So there we go. That was I think one of the more fun moments in racing around trying to get this podcast up on wheels was the realization that actually we can reach out to people and they will talk to us. It's just busy lives.
Hugh, do you want to give a shout out for the other podcast that you do or have done? May resume again.
Yeah, sure. So in you can still find these are all still hosted online. You can find the 3 podcasts I used to run. Real History, REEL, Real History UK, because there is a Real History US. Which I ran for 3 years with my friend Jenna Pateman, who was doing a history degree at the time. I'm a history teacher, so we used to dissect films with historical settings and basically look at the degree to which they were or were not accurate in any way. And we did do a couple of episodes on video games as well. We covered Tomb Raider and we covered Assassin's Creed. And we may bring that back in the future. We may not. We shall see. The other 2, Hustlers of Culture, is the one I've been running longest. That's about 6 years old now. Leslie Pitt, who was a guest on this podcast, was my co-host throughout all of those years. Again, we pick topics usually based around a particular film, talk about them. It's a good podcast to go back to when you just discover a film. So if you've never seen something like A Cure for Wellness by Gore Verbinski. Great, weird, strange horror film from a director with one foot, in the commercial world, but actually clearly wants to be a slightly more oddball auteur. You can just go look at our episodes, pull that one out, just listen to that one. You don't need to have greater context. And then finally, Binges and Box Sets, which was the TV one I used to do with my dear friend Anna Hussey. Again, that's been on hiatus now as well for a couple of years. Depending on her schedule and health and mine, we may bring it back. It depends. But yes, all of those can be found at Spotify, Apple, Google, all the usual places.
Excellent. I have one other podcast that I do with some other friends called Listening to Paint Dry. If you're interested in painting gaming figures, then I recommend giving it a listen. We interview a lot of guests, interview companies, and generally talk about our hobby. I do want to also shout out my friend Nathan Shapiro's podcast, Flame and Fiction, which he was kind enough to put a promo up for our podcast on, and I kept asking him for a promo and have not received one. So if you're still listening at this point, do check that out. It is fantasy storytelling with a kind of Native American influence. It's really really very, very well done. Superb production quality and absolutely worth checking out.
Sure was clear that all of this was new. Concentrating hard like a little girl, smoking for the first time.